The HD800S has been a controversial headphone for me, to say the least. And if you were to tell me 2 weeks ago that this would become one of my favorite headphones and something I would personally place in the S tier category, I would have laughed in your face. I have tried for so long to like this headphone, but I feel like for every upside that it has an equal or greater downside. But I actually think I found a way to make this worthy of the S in its name and finally place this into S tier. And no, it's not tube amplifiers, and no, it's not EQ. Now, if you're surprised to hear me say this, you actually won't be nearly as surprised as this LTT style segue to our sponsor, Headphones.com. Headphones.com is an online retailer of headphones, amplifiers, DACs, speakers, all sorts of different hi-fi equipment. All this gear will fulfill your hearts and ears' dreams of the perfect sound. There's a link down below, check it out. So let's go over the issues. What are the problems with this headphone? The 3 most common complaints I get is lacking in bass response, harsh S&T range / treble response, and a relatively weird sounding sound staging despite being one of the best sound staging headphones out there. The S's and T's come across harsh. This headphone is very fatiguing in the high end, and often people want a little bit more bass. And if you use the right tube amplifier, I actually think that this gets pretty close to A tier for me. But you have to play around a lot with different tube amplifiers and different tube combos to get a really good mixture with the 800S. And a lot of times the best ones, like this Felix Euphoria or that Mogwai from Amson Sound, are just prohibitively expensive, even though they're very, very good. And I still don't think they sound as good as what I'm gonna recommend. The other solution, which in my opinion is a much better one, is EQing. Now, EQing is phenomenal. It's not something that I personally use a lot, but I completely understand and appreciate the utility of it. However, in practice, I find that it's best to make small changes to headphones. And the one downside to EQ that I seem to run into with a lot of headphones, but especially the 800S, is that when you do a lot of EQing to it, the sound is improved a lot, but it comes with a, for lack of a better term, distorted sound. And you get this sense of distortion when you're listening to a heavily EQ'd 800S. Specifically in the bass response, it sounds weird and wonky. And I've tried a number of different EQ profiles, including oratories for the 800S, and no doubt they improve it and definitely bump it up from stock, but still not perfect for me. I also want to say that for any headphone, not just this one, EQ is absolutely worth giving a try, specifically because it's free. It truly is a remarkable software, and I don't want to take anything away from it, but I think that for free software, it's probably the best possible thing you could do to fix small issues. And that's where I find its best use case, is fixing small issues with headphones. The problem with the 800S is that I don't think that the issues here are small. I think they need a pretty drastic change in terms of the sound to fix and even be good in certain areas. So what actually makes this headphone S tier for me is an amplifier. Specifically a niche Pietus Maximus with the Sigma Delta DAC on the back. Now, if you're thinking that this looks a lot like a Schiit Asgard, you're correct. Schiit manufactures this chassis, which is the same as the Asgard, for niche. It's just got a slightly different finish on it, but the internals are very different. Now, what makes this amplifier special and work well with the 800S? This is a solid state amplifier that is designed specifically to sound like a tube amplifier, except it sort of lands in this strange middle ground that I think works perfectly with 800S. Now, I'll have a full review breaking down the exact sound signature of this compared to solid state and compared to tube amplifiers, of course. But for now, I think it's really important to notate, in my opinion, the most important component of this is actually the DAC on the back, which I would select as the Sigma Delta DAC and not the multi-bit DAC. I have both versions here, as you can see, and I think that the Sigma Delta is a much better sounding pairing with this. Now, if you're also thinking, well, what if I just get the amplifier no DAC and just play with my own DAC? That doesn't work as well either. The Sigma Delta is an important component to make this chain work, in my opinion. Now, to explain what this does, you have to understand that I don't necessarily think that this is a great amplifier for every headphone. I think that this is a good amp to pair with certain headphones, 800S included. For example, compared to a reference point, like this is an S9C reference DAC, and it's got sort of a flat playing field for its sound. It's pretty neutral all across the board. In comparison to that, this is a much darker, sounding amplifier with some characteristics that you won't typically get from just going with a darker amp, and I'll explain that in a second. But some of the basic characteristics is a boost in the sub-bass response, especially a warmth added to the mid-bass, a reduction in the upper mid-range / sibilance region, and just a softer overall treble delivery. So for bright amplifiers like this and reference amplifiers flat, this is more like this, a little bit bass heavy, a little bit treble light. Like I said, with certain headphones, that's not going to work. With the 800S, it's almost perfect. Now, one aspect of this, which is probably the deciding factor for me why I prefer this over a EQ profile, is something that I haven't been able to achieve with EQ with 800S, which is actually filling out the soundstage like kind of fullness, actually making it feel big and not small little sounds happening in the distance. This does come with a small sacrifice, and that small sacrifice is a little bit of outward soundstaging width. That's still something that some tube amplifiers like the Felix does really, really well. That this is probably 90% as wide as that. Now, the thing with this though, is that the 800S already has so much soundstaging potential that I don't mind that sacrifice, because what you get is a much fuller sounding mid-range in terms of not only texture and like a nice timbre shift, but also physical size. The vocals seem bigger than they do on a reference amplifier. So it no longer sounds like you're listening to this very small stage of instruments playing in different sections of the headphone. It feels much fuller than stock on a reference amplifier or even a tube amplifier. I haven't been able to achieve that with most without sacrificing other things like it being too bright or whatever. So oddly enough, this ends up fixing every single issue that I have with the 800S. It reduces the sharp top end. It's still detailed sounding, but not fatiguing. The S&T range is quelled a lot. The mid-range is warmed up a little bit, and the sub-bass is enhanced without sounding distorted. And it really, in my opinion, benefits the overall soundstaging representation, especially for room scale. Now, these changes, again, probably not going to benefit every single headphone. You're going to want to pick and choose what headphones you would play with this. And that's one of the downsides to this system is like, it's not going to sound perfect for every headphone. There are going to be headphones that are going to be too dark on this because they're already dark leaning. But this headphone is not the same story. This needs an amplifier like this, in my opinion, to sound its best. So this brings this up to S tier, in my opinion, and I would pick this amplifier with this headphone over anything else and over EQ. Unfortunately, these are out of stock, but they will be restocked eventually. I would just kind of keep it in your mind about something that you might want to purchase. Do some research. It was very cool the way that they actually constructed these. They sent a number of units out to people in the audio community, and they basically went with the one that had the best feedback in terms of sound and landed on this, the Pietus Maximus. So I think that this is definitely worth keeping in mind. Now, this is not without its downsides. The total outward boundary of soundstage is slightly reduced. Now, since this headphone has such a great soundstaging ability to begin with, this slight reduction is still better than almost every headphone out there. But compared to a reference, let's say S9C DAC and amp for soundstaging width, it's not quite as wide. The other potential downside is that you may like the general nature of what the 800S is in stock form. And if you like that brighter sound, and if it just fits your ears well, then I wouldn't recommend this upgrade or change for you. The third downside is that because of the price range, because of the type of amplifier that this is, the DAC that's in it, this is not the highest resolution you will get from an 800S. So if you were getting an 800S for pure resolution, this isn't quite it. This still resolves very well, but I've certainly heard more resolving amplifiers, but they come at the cost of things like a lack of bass dynamics, kind of a stale mid-range, and kind of a sharp sounding treble response. This fixes almost all of those things on a hardware level, not a software level, which is extremely impressive. Now, if I'm being completely honest about my experience here, I didn't expect this amp to sound this different, especially between, let's say, the multi-bit option, which is the same amplifier, just with two different DACs built in. But the differences are so significant that even Shelby, who a lot of times thinks that two vastly different headphones to me, she thinks that they sound the same. She can even tell the difference between the two amps. And that really, to me, solidified that the changes that I was hearing really were as significant as I thought they were. And I was honestly kind of surprised by this. And before you ask, this show's sponsor is headphones.com, but I'm not sponsored by Niche or Sennheiser. I don't have an affiliate link for this video or anything like that. It's just a freaking amazing combination between these two, and really legitimately turns this into an S-tier experience that I would compare against other S-tier headphones. So let's do that. Let's compare against high-end headphones. Outside of some completely overpriced electrostatic headphones, I think that this is the best example of sound staging in a headphone. And yes, this includes the new Aria Organic, which is very, very good. I think that this combo is a little bit better than that. Compared to the Meze Empyrean, which is one of my favorite headphones, still is, the Meze Empyrean has a darker, richer, and fuller sounding bass even still. It's a little bit stronger in the bass department than this headphone is really capable of without getting like extremely distorted sounding. But I actually think that the new mid-range improvements are a little bit more consistent than the Empyrean is. And the Empyrean has a bit of an upper mid-range shout that the 800S doesn't have at all. Also, just because of the frequency characteristics of the 800S, they're not pushed forward as much vocal-wise as the Empyreans are, but the vocal clarity and separation from the background is actually a bit better. So I actually think that the vocals are an improvement over the Empyrean, which is pretty impressive to me. Treble resolution is about a toss-up between these two, and I would compare the detail capability of both to be relatively on par with each other. But timbre capability on the 800S, especially for treble, is actually better than the timbre capability of the Empyrean, which in comparison feels a little bit plasticky in sound. It's still not bad, but in comparison, the woods and the metallics come across a little bit stronger on the 800S. When it comes to a very different sounding headphone like the DZ, the resolution capability of the DZ is better. It sounds like definitely faster overall than 800S does. But the 800S beats it in a pretty big category, which is sound staging and the representation of the instruments in the room. It still is much wider sounding than this headphone is. Compared to the sound staging capability of the 1266, the 1266 is closer, but I still think that the 800S beats it in terms of room representation. Now, a 10 out of 10 perfect headphone for me would probably be something like the resolution and detail capability of the DZ, the bass response of the Empyrean, and the rest of the sound staging and room interpretation stuff that happens on the 800S, because there are moments when you're listening to the 800S where you truly do not feel like you're wearing a pair of headphones. And that is something that is rare in other headphones, and the 800S does it frequently. Now, I still want to say here, just because I would put this in the S tier category, it doesn't make it perfect. This headphone, even with the Pietis Maximus, still has flaws, just like every other headphone out there. There are still things, still little small adjustments that I wish I could make. Things that EQ doesn't quite fix, things that amplification can't quite fix. It's just these small little adjustments that go into a more refined, potential perfect headphone. But this combo puts this headphone into one of the best I've heard, but only with this combo. I would still place this pretty firmly in B tier, sometimes A tier, depending on the right amplification, if you don't have an amplifier that affects the sound as much as this does. So yeah, if you're looking for an upgrade or a side grade for your 800S, I would really consider thinking about the Pietis Maximus and picking one of those up when it does go back in stock. Like I said, this is a bit of a surprise to me because I haven't really liked this headphone on most things I've heard it on. But yeah, I think that with the right equipment, this is an absolutely killer headphone. So thanks for watching. Thanks Headphones for sponsoring today's video. Headphones.com is a high quality online retailer with excellent customer service, a great return policy, and a chat assistant if you need any help. There's a link down below. Check it out. Thanks a lot.